When they took us into Bergen-Belsen, I think Bergen-Belsen was worse than Auschwitz. Bergen-Belsen was a death trap. They dumped 30 of us women into one barrack meant for maybe 40 people. There was no food, there were no blankets, there were no bunks, and the only food we ever got was we would sneak behind the German kitchens to steal whatever they threw away. Had we been caught, we would have been shot. It was truly a death trap, and typhus was the killer. Everybody in Bergen-Belsen had typhus, and we were all beginning to die. Then suddenly one day they decided to select 30 women to go to another camp, to a work camp, slave labor camp, and there were maybe 1,600 of those around the countries, Germany, Austria, Poland, and France, and others. And somehow my sister and I were among the 30 people who were taken to this other camp. Again, we were put into cattle cars. This time, my sister was already sick with typhus and dying. And I remember growing up very quickly because there wasn't a thing I could do for her. She was really dying, and I was totally helpless. Once I caught some rainwater for her. After many days of that horror, we got into this small camp. The camp was called Venusberg. It was run by SS women who were very brutal, very cruel. In fact, I got my one and only physical beating from this woman because I got into line for food, and my sister, who was very sick, could not stand in line, so I gave her my bowl, and I got in line again. Even in that good quote-unquote camp, we were starving, and I was very hungry, but when I got in line the second time, this particular monstrous big SS woman recognized that it was my second time, and she beat me up. And so I never got my second bowl of soup. There were many other instances there that were really of horror. We also worked very hard. We worked making airplanes for the German Reich at Messerschmitt. And by then, there were some prisoners of war in that factory. We were not allowed to communicate with them, of course, but through the grapevine, we would hear that it was almost over. Just hang in there and the war will be over. And we tried. We tried to hang in there, and I got very sick with typhus. And typhus is a very debilitating disease. You have a very high fever, throwing up, diarrhea, very thirsty. And certainly we had no medical care whatsoever. I was thrown into this barrack for the sick, from which very few people returned. And when they decided to evacuate that camp too, they would have probably, or I'm sure they did, burned that barrack with all those people who were too far gone. My sister and another friend dragged me out of there. Again, we were put into cattle cars, my very last trip. Those cattle cars took 16 days, sealed, very hot, and perhaps it was the temperature of maybe 105, 106, whatever I had at the time. I was mostly delirious, mostly totally unconscious. I do remember instances when they would open the sealed doors, and my sister would prop me up against the back of the car, and she would pinch my cheeks and make me sit up somewhat straight so that I would not be thrown out with the corpses. And that's how we made it through the 16 days of horror. We got into Mauthausen. Mauthausen was the camp where my father and Norbert were taken. The camp where Norbert survived, where my father was killed just weeks before the end. And I remember very little except being very, very sick. We were 6 on a bunk, like sardines. And I remember one day, I looked up and there was a black soldier, a black American soldier. You see, the Allies, of course, knew what was happening to us by 1942. Unfortunately, we were not a priority. In fact, They refused to bomb the railroad tracks, which took the victims to Auschwitz. And so the leadership of the Allies knew what was happening. The soldiers didn't. And this particular black soldier that I remember was standing there totally devastated. The horror on his face is something that even in my state I cannot ever forget. And I was, unable to really distinguish between nightmare and reality. I weighed about 60 pounds, and I was really more dead than alive. I have one memory of that soldier, and I will conclude my presentation with this poem, which I call The Black Messiah. A black GI stood by the door. I never saw a black before. He'll set me free before I die. I thought he must be the Messiah. A black Messiah came for me. He stared with eyes that didn't see. He never heard a single word which hung absurd upon my tongue. And then he simply froze in place. The shock, the horror on his face. He didn't weep, he didn't cry, but deep within his gentle eyes, a flood of devastating pain, his innocence forever slain. For me, with yet another dawn, I found my black Messiah gone. And on we went our separate ways for many years, without a trace. But there's a special bond we share, which has grown strong because we dare to live, to hope, to smile, and yet we vow not ever to forget.